Rocket in My Pocket, Defying Gravity with Levity, From the Frontiers of Space to the Frontiers of Consciousness, by Cerridwen Fallingstar. Narrated by the author. Dedication. For my mother, Jane Lesh, who taught me to love literature. For my father, Michael Lesh, who taught me to love nature. And for my grandparents, Arby and Edward Farmer, who taught me to reach for the stars. Introduction. People like to say, it's not rocket science. But in my childhood, it was all rocket science. My father worked, first for McDonnell Douglas Aircraft, then for aerospace, designing rockets for space travel and warfare. To boldly go where no man has gone before, as the famous TV show intoned. My father was a magician of the sky, exploring the unknown. For all I knew, the folks on Star Trek were probably his co-workers. It was my father who talked to John and Bobby Kennedy down from the ledge during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was my father who designed the first big spy-in-the-sky satellite that could take enormous, detailed pictures of Soviet military installations. He moved us from Southern California to upstate New York for that covert, top-secret operation in which aerospace and Eastman Kodak cooperated to make my father's blueprint a reality, though the cover story was that Kodak had simply, quote, made him a better offer. The Cold War was the core reality of my childhood, followed immediately by the sexual revolution in my teens and 20s, when the rockets became metaphorical fireworks. This led to a lot of fireworks at my house, as my father's blood pressure shot up like it was Cape Canaveral every time a young swain of mine appeared. There was never a better time to be young than the 1970s before AIDS, when the new paganism took root, and feminism and gay rights were ascendant. There were orgies and demonstrations. There were sweet dreams and flying machines and infinite hope for the future. But my family didn't see it like that. When I moved abruptly to the left politically, protesting against the Vietnam War, followed by working for feminism, gay rights, and saving the environment, my Republican parents lamented that their little apple had fallen far from the tree. Or as my Southern grandmother Mimi said, if you find an orange under an apple tree, it's not a miracle. Something's not right. In 1975, when I was 22 and working as a journalist for a feminist newspaper, my editor came in and said, there's a witch on trial for fortune-telling. My hand shot up. I'll take that story. And so, my life of growing up in a scientific household, where all religion was held in contempt, took a dramatic swerve. My life as a political pagan priestess and teacher looked outlandish to my father, like a refutation of his conservative scientific views. But at heart, we wanted all the same things. A healthy planet, a safe world for our children. We wanted truth and justice to be the American way, though we disagreed on whether they actually were or not. He yearned to explore physical outer space. I spent my life exploring metaphysical inner space, slipping through the gateways at the intersection of the betwixt and between. My father helped save the world once. I've spent my life attempting to do the same. This apple may have rock and rolled on down the hill, but it came from this tree. So, get ready for takeoff. The rocket is on the launching pad. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, blast off! Rocket Man. My father wanted to be an astronaut, but he settled for work behind the scenes as an engineer designing the rockets for the space program in the 60s. He had only a BA, in history of all things, from Occidental, but he had somehow wangled a job with Douglas Aircraft, where his innate brilliance at design landed him a job at Aerospace, designing top-secret satellites and rockets for the government during the height of the Cold War space race. Most of my dad's co-workers had PhDs, often more than one. When they asked where he had got his doctorate, he would smile thinly and say, "The School of Hard Knocks." At company picnics, when the other men stripped down to their t-shirts in the hot sun, my father kept his long-sleeved shirt on, rather than reveal the tattoo he had gotten while in the army. A hand and arm, holding a sword with "To the Victor" inscribed beneath, something he felt marked him out as a lower-class roughneck among his more educated peers. When my father was applying for the job at Aerospace, men in dark suits with dangerous eyes came to inspect our house, to interview my father and my mother as well, probing for any hazardous secrets they might possess. A man in my father's position had to have top-secret security clearance, had to be clear of a penchant for drugs, or boys, or prostitutes, or anything which could be used to blackmail or extract information. I remember the pages-long form he filled out with my mother's help. At the end of the questionnaire was a final inquiry. "What else do you think we should know about you?" To which my father responded, "I am pure as the driven snow." My mother argued with him about that answer. Suppose the Vetters had no sense of humor? But my father insisted. The response stayed. And my father was hired, he always believed, on the strength of that final question. Like most men in suits fighting the Cold War, my father fancied himself a James Bondish sort, minus the martinis and loose women, of course. He had a briefcase with a combination lock. He was flummoxed when I took one look at the lock, dialed the numbers to 007, and popped the case open. Transparent to a 9-year-old. He changed the combination, and I never figured out the new one. Though I had never seen a James Bond movie, way too risque and violent for children, Bond's dapper image saturated the media, and Dad's workplace reeked of secrets. My father wore a big identifying badge with his picture, and had to punch in secret numbers to get the aerospace building doors to open. The security guards seemed friendly enough, to my father, but any fool could see they were wearing guns. Once inside, I remember ordinary offices and drafting tables where people just got to draw all day. Rockets and spaceships. But coolest of all was the area of my father's specialty, the computer room. Computers at that time were huge floor-to-ceiling affairs, making pocket-a-queep noises and spewing out reams of paper with seemingly random sets of numbers, possibly code, emblazoned on them. Computers were new technology, and my father was an early programmer, privy to the mysteries of the bulky, wayward beasts. As my father showed our family around, beaming with boyish glee, I realized that when he went to work, he just got to play all day, unlike my mother and all the other mothers I knew, who spent their days changing diapers, mopping floors, and throwing Lipton soup mix onto pot roast, and canned fruit into jello molds, shaped like garish rainbow palaces. Was it too late to change into a boy? I realized how seriously my father took his work after I gave him the mumps. The mumps had been agonizing for me for 2 days. My brother and sister barely registered fevers. But then my father got sick, and mumps in grown-ups can be a serious malady indeed. One night, my mother burst out of their bedroom, where my father had been sequestered unseen for the past 3 days. "Your father thinks he's a computer," my mother cried. "I have to go to the drugstore to get him medicine. Stay here and take care of the kids and don't go in the bedroom." "What's wrong with Dad?" my sister whimpered after Mom raced out the door. "Nothing," I said, thinking quickly. "Just a touch of computeritis and mumps." I read a couple of picture books to my siblings. "Okay, you guys just lie down on the couch," I said, tucking blankets around them. "I'm going to take Dad some water." My sister objected. "But Mom said—" "She meant you and Mark couldn't go in. She left me in charge. Close your eyes now." Annie pinched her eyes shut. I got the glass of water and walked into the bedroom. My father was thrashing a bit on the bed. His eyes were glassy, and his neck was swollen as wide as his head. In between bouts of panting, he was making familiar noises. Pocket-a-queep, pocket-a-queep, followed by the whirring noise of the printout. My father was turning into a computer. I walked out, still carrying the full water glass, and poured the water down the sink. Far from being terrorized, I was excited. No one else had a father who was a computer. Meanwhile, my mother had been pulled over by a cop while speeding on her way to the pharmacy. "I have to get to the pharmacy before it closes," she sobbed hysterically. "My husband thinks he's turning into a computer, and I have 3 little children home alone." Cowed by her sincere hysteria, the cop said, Okay, ma'am, just go. Go home to your kids." My mother tore in the door, wild-eyed, and rushed to the bedroom. I don't know what magic bullet the pharmacist gave her, but by the next day, much to my disappointment, my father was no longer a computer. Computers were not my father's sole source of data. He and his friends constantly observed all flying creatures for hints on how to make their flying machines more aerodynamic and efficient. They watched films of all sorts of birds and insects in flight, slowing them down so they could observe every aspect of takeoff and landing. Bumblebees were a thorn, or maybe a stinger, in my father's side. He and his colleagues studied them intensively. They were simply too fat, too round, too unwieldy to get off the ground. Their wings were too small, and they didn't beat them enough times per second. Bumblebees were the most aerodynamically unsound creatures ever. A fat kid with a kite had a better chance of getting airborne. Dad and his fellow engineers ran every possible program and diagram, and they proved it conclusively. Bumblebees cannot fly. Except, of course, they do. One sunny day, I saw my father sitting motionless in our garden. A bumblebee bobbled around him like a drunken dirigible. With the melancholic air of a doctor informing a patient he has a terminal illness, my father whispered bitterly, "You can't really do that, you know." You'd think he would have been more cheerful. The bumblebee didn't have a PhD either. Nuclear family. "All right, kids, that's the signal," Mrs. Adams chirped over the alarm sounding in our classrooms. "Under your desks." The rest of my first grade class quickly scuttled into their flimsy plywood desk chairs. I stood up. "Mrs. Adams? Actually, getting under our desks won't help in case of a nuclear attack. See, if the bomb lands anywhere close, we'll be vaporized instantly. If it's farther away, but close enough to break windows or collapse the ceiling, then we will all die of radiation poisoning anyway. You can't hide from radiation under a desk." A wail emerged from red-haired Jenny, followed by snuffling from a few other kids. The alarm stopped. "Okay, you can come out from under your desk now and get back to your work," Mrs. Adams said with cheerful determination. "Now, Sherry." She took me by the arm and led me outside the classroom. "Now, Sherry," she said again sweetly, "why would you say those mean things in our class?" "It's not mean, Mrs. Adams, it's just the facts. My dad works for aerospace, and I heard him and his friends talking. You can't hide from radiation. The drills won't work. Even the bomb shelters won't work." "Sherry, I understand your father works for aerospace. Such a fine young man. But we don't want to frighten the other children, do we?" "So the drills are just pretend?" "Well, I wouldn't say that. If it's just pretend, let's pretend Superman is going to save us. Then we won't have to waste time squeezing under our desks." "We are not going to talk about this anymore. When the alarm sounds, get under your desk, and please do not mention the word radiation in front of the other children again. Understand?" I nodded. I liked Mrs. Adams and wanted to please her. She let me sit in a corner and read by myself when the other kids were puzzling over Dick and Jane. I had taught myself to read at the age of 4 and could not believe we were forced to go over and over the alarmingly boring Dick and Jane, the most tedious tots who ever cursed literature. I had tried to liven things up by emphasizing the emotions in the paltry script. "Funny, funny, Spot," I would laugh, miming hysterical laughter. This had led to another outside-the-classroom conversation. "Now, Sherry, just read in a normal tone of voice. We are not auditioning for a play." "I'm just trying to make it more interesting. It's so boring. They do the same thing every day. Can't we read Robin Hood instead? The other kids are never going to learn to read if they think it's all as boring as Dick and Jane." Hence my delightful isolation at a corner table, where I could read my own library books to my heart's content. Mrs. Adams survived the first grade with me, as she had survived 40 years of challenging children. But then she switched to teaching 6th grade, just as I entered that year, and I was in her class again. It was a fiasco. Mrs. Adams was a perfect first grade teacher, but in no way equipped to handle the surly, rebellious tweens her little angels had become in the ensuing 5 years between first and sixth. I, of course, never acted out and did my best to be a perfect student. But in my own way, I continued to be a constant trial for her. When my mother was hospitalized for a week, Mrs. Adams called me over to her desk after the bell rang. "Is your mother having a good rest?" she asked with syrupy concern. "Oh, she's not resting. She's in the hospital for a hysterectomy," I informed her. "Well, we don't say that. It's not polite." I was flummoxed. My mother had presented the situation to me in an utterly matter-of-fact manner. When she explained that a hysterectomy involved removing her uterus, I felt two things. One was sadness, that my first home on this earth was going to perish. The other was concern. One of the girls in my scout troop said her father had divorced her mother because her mother didn't have sex with him anymore. "Won't Daddy miss having sex?" I asked timidly. "Oh, heavens! We'll still be able to have sex after I heal. I would miss it too. Don't worry about that." While I did not understand much about the mechanics of sex, I knew it was important to my parents, the mysterious glue that kept our household so much happier than that of most of my friends. When my father would look up at the warm summer sky, grin, and stroke his hand along my mother's spine, saying, "It's a mighty sexy day today, pussycat," I knew that it was my mother's beauty, not the hot yellow sun, that made it a sexy day, and I felt proud. "Why don't we talk about hysterectomies?" I asked Mrs. Adams. "We just don't." But the conversation that finally broke Mrs. Adams' spirit involved mathematics. While normally a good student, I was hopeless at math. The multiplication tables had been grueling, as it involved memorizing boring numbers. "I shouldn't have to do this," I grumbled in a fit of psychic foresight. "We're going to have computers to do this for us when I grow up." My father laughed. "You know how big the computers are at my office," he said, referring to the huge floor-to-ceiling gizmos he operated at Aerospace. "Are you planning to live in a mansion?" "They'll be smaller by then. We'll be able to carry them around with us." "Ha!" my father snorted. "I'd like to see that." But horrid as multiplication had been, division was far worse, especially long division. Mrs. Adams showed saintly patience, but my father had been attempting to teach me, quote, new math at home, and it was a case of too many cooks having totally wrecked the pot. The more my father yelled and screamed that with my IQ I could easily do this, and I was just refusing to learn in order to drive him crazy, the more traumatized I became, until the very sight of numbers caused me to break into a cold sweat. Mrs. Adams was as mystified as my father about why anything having to do with numbers should cause me to collapse into a state of mental polio. One afternoon after school, as she attempted to explain my failures on a math test, I burst out. "I'm going to be a writer anyway. Lots of writers hate division. Swinburne hated division." Mrs. Adams regarded me skeptically. "Now, Sherry, what makes you think Swinburne hated division?" Drawing myself up tall, I quoted the passage I had memorized, taking comfort in the fact that a famous poet felt the same way about division that I did. "Time turns the old days to derision, our loves into corpses or wives, and marriage and death and division make barren our lives." Division is making my life barren, Mrs. Adams. She shook her head hopelessly. "Go home, Sherry."